Hello, and welcome to this special preview of our pre-concert talk. In just a few minutes, we will cover the basics of this week's concert so you can get up to speed when you have the time, even if that's in the car on your way to the performance. The centerpiece of this concert is the Fourth Symphony by Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. You'll also hear the Sinfonia Concertante by Sergei Prokofiev with German cellist Alban Gerhardt. And the concert opens with the premiere of a new work by Australian composer Liza Lim, commissioned as part of the Sydney Symphony's 50 Fanfares project. All this led by Finnish conductor Petteri Inkinen, chief conductor of the Deutsche Radio Philharmonie and a regular visitor to Sydney. Liza Lim is one of Australia's most acclaimed contemporary composers. Currently a professor of composition at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, Lim was named Composer of the Year for 2024 at Germany's premier classical music awards. She has been commissioned by leading ensembles across the globe, including the Sydney Symphony, where she was resident composer in 2005 and 2006. This new work, Salutations to the Shells, traces a history of Sydney Harbour through shells. Before European colonisation, the First Nations people who lived near the foreshore and further south to Port Jackson, Botany Bay and beyond, built large monuments out of the shells of sea creatures that were a key part of their food supply. But these weren't mere piles of carelessly discarded rubbish. These monuments were up to 12 metres high and a key feature of the built environment pre-colonisation. Those monuments were destroyed and burnt by British settlers who turned the resulting paste into mortar to build the settlement of Sydney. And still today, if you go to the Rocks, where some buildings from the early days of settlement still stand, you can see chunks of shells in the mortar. Lim's title also refers to the shells of the Sydney Opera House, this extraordinary building in which the piece will be premiered. So the piece references the Indigenous shell monuments, the buildings of early Sydney, and finally the iconic symbol of modern Sydney. It's a reminder that our world is built on, and sometimes from, the remains of a thriving First Nations culture that existed before European invasion. As this piece was commissioned as part of the Sydney Symphony's 50 Fanfares project, Lim has used the musical language of fanfares in her piece. Originating in military processions, there is a grandeur and formality about a fanfare that you will hear in the music, but underneath that there is a shimmering, ethereal presence, evoking those opalescent monuments that are no longer with us. The next piece on the program is the Sinfonia Concertante by Sergei Prokofiev. A Sinfonia Concertante is somewhere between a concerto and a symphony. It usually has soloists with a prominent role, like in a concerto, but the soloists also play as part of the whole orchestra, like in a symphony. It's hard to describe exactly, and it doesn't help that our soloist in this concert, Alban Gerhardt, has described the work as a symphony for the cello. So make of that what you will. Born in 1891 in what is now Ukraine, Prokofiev's musical talents were identified very early. He wrote his first piano piece at 5, and by 9 had composed an opera. Prokofiev was accepted into the St. Petersburg Conservatory at just 13, and over the next few years made a name for himself as both a composer and pianist. He was successful early, travelling to London and Paris and collaborating with Sergei Diaghilev, the legendary impresario of the Ballet Russe. But after the First World War, and then when revolution broke out in Russia in 1917, Prokofiev decided he would move to America until things calmed down at home. He was a big star in the States, and also in Paris. As British journalist James Meek recently put it, Prokofiev had his portrait painted by Matisse, Picasso attended his premieres, he hung out with Charlie Chaplin in Biarritz, and jammed with Gershwin in his flat. Yet in 1936 he gave this all up to return to Russia, where he had a predictably difficult time with the Soviet censors, who demanded music that celebrated Russia and the proletariat rather than bourgeois Western technique. But he found a great champion later in life in the young cellist Mstislav Rostropovich, who supported Prokofiev against the apparatus of the state. Rostropovich inspired Prokofiev to write his second cello concerto, which he then later revised and retitled Symphony Concerto, though sadly Prokofiev died before he heard this new version. I have always found Prokofiev's music fascinating, particularly because it's so hard to pigeonhole. You probably know his most famous pieces, like Romeo and Juliet or Peter and the Wolf, rich, tuneful pieces that belong far more to the 19th century than to the 20th. But then so many of his other works have a dark, bitter, sarcastic sense of humour and quite a bleak outlook, the sort of music one would expect living in Stalin's Russia. But our soloist Alban Gerhardt argues that this piece absolutely belongs to the same category as Romeo and Juliet. He calls it kids' music, written for Rostropovich, who he calls a big kid in the sweetie store. Certainly this is a big, meaty work, with sweeping melodies and plenty of drama. The cello soloist is the central character of this story, and along the way interacts with most of the various families of the orchestra. It also quotes from a Russian drinking song before the soloist finishes with a flurry of notes right at the top of its range. It's a wild ride, though I'm still not totally certain where we end up, but I suspect Prokofiev would enjoy the ambiguity. Beethoven once described the famous 4 notes at the start of his 5th symphony as fate knocking on the door, and Tchaikovsky's 4th symphony opens with a similar repetitive proclamation from the horns. It's impossible not to draw the connection, especially when Tchaikovsky himself wrote, "The introduction is the seed of the whole symphony. This is fate, that fateful force which prevents the impulse to happiness from attaining its goal, which jealously ensures that peace and happiness shall not be complete and unclouded, which hangs above the head like the sword of Damocles, unwaveringly, constantly poisoning the soul. It is an invisible force that can never be overcome, merely endured, hopelessly." Over the course of the symphony's 4 movements, you really feel like you're experiencing an entire lifetime in music, and all the highs and lows that one could imagine. Again and again, Tchaikovsky gives us glimpses of peace, of happiness, of joy, but always that inevitable motif returns, a reminder that we are not, in fact, the masters of our fate. But just when we think it's all too bleak and we can't go on, the final movement arrives with a burst of energy and enthusiasm. As Tchaikovsky wrote, "Do not say that everything in this world is sad. Joy is a simple but powerful force. Rejoice in the rejoicing of others. To live is still possible." Much of what we know about this symphony comes from letters between Tchaikovsky and his patron, Nadezhda von Meck, and in those letters Tchaikovsky goes into great detail about his process of writing the symphony. But what I think is much more interesting is what Tchaikovsky was doing with the symphony, rather than why. See, ever since Joseph Haydn standardized the structure of a symphony, it had followed the same, essentially German format known as sonata form. In sonata form, each movement of a symphony has musical ideas that are stated, developed, and restated within a movement, but the development is the main concern. Think of a Haydn or a Mozart symphony like 3 or 4 boxes of Lego. The main theme of each movement is what's on the outside of each box, but the art is in pulling it apart and seeing what else you can build out of those same limited components. Then in the second movement you move on to the next box, and so on. The mark of your quality as a composer was in showing how you built a hawk from the components for a handsaw. The quality of the hawk, what the music is actually about, is of far less concern. But in Russian music, and indeed in Russian art more broadly, the key concern is stasis, presenting a scene or a musical idea, and then jumping to the next one without showing the connective tissue. Anyone who has read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy will recognize this. It's episodic rather than linear. Tchaikovsky, steeped in Russian tradition but also a student of Western sonata form, had been wrestling for years with how to combine these 2 radically different approaches. And in the 4th symphony, he finally achieved it. In constructing this fate narrative that runs through the symphony, he was able to present a series of episodic tableaus and show us the connections between them. He gives us the Russian way of telling a story and the Western European way of developing the musical ideas. Of course, when you come up with something totally new, everyone hates it. A reviewer for the New York Post described it as semi-barbaric, while back home he was criticised by the Russian musical establishment for sullying good Russian music with impure European ideas. Happily for us though, its obvious musical qualities won the day, and it now ranks among the most performed and best loved symphonies in the repertoire. Tchaikovsky wrote in one of his letters to Madame von Meck, "Where words finish, music begins," which seems like the perfect way to wrap up and to let you enjoy the concert. If you can, join me in the Northern Foyer of the Sydney Opera House for an extended pre-concert talk 45 minutes before each performance, where I will be joined by composer Liza Lim and cellist Alban Gerhardt for further insights into the music. Thank you, and enjoy the show.